Welcome back to section 3 of chapter 24. In this section, we're going to see how America starts to move towards war itself. We're going to specifically look at the U.S. foreign policy prior to the official entry into World War II, how the U.S. started to align itself with the Allied powers, and what was the outcome of Pearl Harbor. So, it's no secret at this time that the United States is politically and socially allied with Britain. We share a common language, ancestors, and so what we try to do is help them out as best as we can. But remember, at this time, America is isolationist. We don't want to get involved in world affairs. And so what Roosevelt does is he actually convinces Congress to pass the cash and carry policy here. And it's a policy where the United States sold arms, so weapons, guns, tanks, to warring nations in violation of the Neutrality Act. Remember, the Neutrality Act said the United States could not sell any arms to a country involved in war. So that would be countries like Germany or Britain or Japan. There is an exception, though, with the cash and carry policy. As long as the country paid cash to the United States and they shipped the arms on their own boats, then we would sell it to them. And this is really in response to Britain, because by 1914, they were really the only ones fighting Germany in the war. France had lost already. Italy's allied with Germany at this time, and the USSR isn't fighting, the US isn't in, so really Germany's the only one at this time. And so the United States gave them 50 destroyers in exchange for leases on their bases. So even with this policy, Britain wasn't able to pay, and so the United States made a deal. If you let us use your British bases in the Caribbean and in Newfoundland, then we will give you 50 of our old destroyers from the Navy, which worked out great. We got rid of some of our old machinery, and we got to use their base. And so as a result of all this is going on, the United States is getting further and further away from neutrality and closer to war. At the same time, you have the start of the Axis powers, and it became public on September 27, 1940, that Germany, Italy, and Japan signed a pact to become the Axis powers. It's important that you know who the Axis powers are. This is something you must memorize. Germany, Italy, and Japan were the Axis powers. So, we already started to talk about how politically America is getting closer with Britain and getting closer to the war. And what's happening is as Nazism is, becoming more and more dominant, and Germany is taking over more and more countries. Think of all the countries they invaded from last night's homework. This starts to worry Congress, and in fact, Congress begins to boost defense spending. Even though we're, a neutral country at this time, we start to increase more in economics or in military spending. We also instituted the first ever military draft in American history. And so even though we were in peace and we weren't, engaged in a war, we started the draft. And Roosevelt was no dummy. He knew that we were going to war and this was coming. And so even though in his third election he promised to keep the U.S. out of the war, he knew exactly what he was doing, and that eventually it was only a matter of time until the United States got involved. And so Roosevelt wins his third election. On a side note, he is the first president to win 3 elections. Every other president stopped and followed George Washington's example of only 2 terms. But nonetheless, he wins his third election by trying to create this arsenal of democracy. That's what he calls it. And what the arsenal for democracy is that the United States is going to help fight Nazism in Germany by helping the United Kingdom any way we can without getting involved in the war. And one of the ways that we do that is by the Lend-Lease Act, because by the end of 1940, Britain can't pay for goods anymore. They have no money, they're in serious debt, and they're in the middle of the war. So what Roosevelt negotiates is that the U.S. would give aid to any country that had similar diplomatic interests. And then once the war was over, these countries would return the material back to the United States. And so, for example, the United States would lend out tanks or airplanes to Britain and later on to France, China, and even the USSR, once Hitler invades them, uh, to use and to fight Nazism and fascism. And then once the war was over, they would return it to the United States. In theory, not much got returned, but it was more about the United States providing these countries with weapons when we were still neutral. So, as a result of all the actions that the United States has taken, we're slowly sending arms to Germany through the cash and carry policy, through the leasing of bases, the Lend-Lease Act. Germany starts to get a little nervous. And to prevent Britain and later on the USSR from getting these goods from the US, Hitler established what's called the German War Pact. And so at night, groups of anywhere from 5 to 40 submarines would patrol the northern Atlantic in a group, and as the Allied forces would send a bunch of carriers over with all the supplies, here you can see all the supply boats, they would have these red boats here in the picture. That would be the convoy boats. So they would try and protect them. However, there wasn't many because they didn't have a lot at this time, and so the German U-boats in these wolf packs would gang up together and take down the transportation vessels. And so this was one way that Germany signaled to the rest of the world that they were starting to get nervous about the United States' entry into the war. That if, just helping out Britain and the USSR with supplies can make them nervous, imagine what the rest of the war would be like if we entered. Unfortunately for Germany, or for Britain and the USSR, Germany was very successful at this. This is just like World War I, if you remember, with the convoy system. The German U-boats are very specialized, and the German sailors are very good at taking out plane or boats like this, and the U-boats are relentless. So, what's Roosevelt's war policy? He is constantly attacked at home from his war policy. There are a lot of isolationists in Congress at this time that believe that the US is too involved in world affairs. We shouldn't be giving any aid to a foreign country. Then you have some war hawks in Congress that believe that we should be in the war already and that we need to take action faster. So Roosevelt's really criticized from both sides here. Um, Roosevelt in 1941 does try to help the global community, and he met Britain off the coast of Canada. And by meaning Britain, I mean he met the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, at what's called the Atlantic Charter. And here, both countries met, and they pledged to do three things: promote collective security and self determination. Excuse me, two things. Britain was really hoping that the U.S. would also commit to send troops and engage in the war. But that is something that the United States could not promise. Roosevelt wanted for the U.S. to help out Britain, and he even is on record saying he would try and wage war and force an incident that would push the United States into war. But at this conference, he's unable to do so. But the things that they agree upon here, the promote collective security and self-determination, these ideas become the basis for the United Nations, which comes about after World War. And so, even though full-scale war seemed inevitable, it wasn't till the Germans fired on the U.S. destroyer, which prompted the U.S. to start firing on German U-boats, which brought us, together and battling each other. And this is really, at this point, where the battle heats up between the two countries. And even though we are still neutral, remember, at this time, the United States is not in a war with Germany yet. It's only, a matter of time before we do. So while this is all going on, we talked about how there's the Atlantic Charter. We're starting to fight Germany as they attack our boats and we attack their U-ships. Think about what's happening in Asia and Japan. The Japanese already controlled Chinese Manchuria. They invaded in 1937, and This really challenged the open door policy that we have in China. Remember, way back from chapter 18, the open door policy is that China is open for all nations to trade in, and the Japanese aggression challenged this. And so the only thing that was really standing in Japan's way was the US and our islands over there, especially Guam and American Samoa, um, and us in China, because the rest of the European powers were busy worrying about what was going to happen in Europe, and some countries were already engaged in a war. And so the US puts a series of sanctions on Japan after they take over China. And Japan becomes very irritated and sends out many decoded messages about how they're irritated and they're going to attack us and all this stuff. And we, as a country, decode these messages, and Roosevelt puts the nation's Navy on high alert that something's happening. We don't know where, we don't know when, we don't know what, but Japan is getting aggravated. And so, even though we try and establish peace talks with Japan, Prime Minister Tojo, on in November, uh, of 1941, ordered his generals to draw up plans for attack, and this signaled the end of peace talks. The United States knew that he did this because we know about the messages. We just didn't know when or where he would strike. And then on December 6th, during the peace talks, Japan sends out a message to the rest of Japanese ambassadors and information that they will never accept a peace agreement with the United States. And so we know that something is happening quick. It's about to happen. We didn't realize that it would be the next day an attack would occur. So on December 7th, it's known as a day that will live in infamy, we have Pearl Harbor. Six Japanese aircraft carriers in the Pacific sent in a dive bomber to scope out the area. And you can see the path here of the dive bomber. They come in, they circle around the island of Oahu to Pearl Harbor right here to see what's going on. Once they get kind of the all clear from the dive bomber, 180 warplanes attack the harbor there. They attack in the early morning, catching the men by surprise, and they could barely fight back. I mean, the amount of damage we do on the Japanese is so limited. And in fact, this is one of the most deadly attacks on American soil. It was up until September 11th, actually. 2,400 men died, another 1,100 were injured. 21 ships were either sunk or damaged, and you can see on the map here, all of the ships in yellow and red were sunk or damaged, so that's a large portion of it. The only reason historians believe that, the U.S. Navy really survived at this time is because 6 of the ships that were supposed to be docked here were actually in the ocean on a practice assignment, and so they were spared. And between those and the few ships that were left here, we really were able to have a somewhat functioning navy until we could build it back up again. So what happens as a result? The very next day, Roosevelt addressed Congress and makes his famous "A Day That Will Live in Infamy" speech. He asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan, which Congress gives very quickly. As a result, 3 days later, Germany and Italy, who are Japanese allies, declared war on the United States. So now it's official. We're at war with both Japan, Italy, and Germany. And this caused the U.S. to have a war on 2 fronts, in the Pacific and in Europe. And as a result of being bombed at home, many of the people in Congress who were previously isolationists that didn't want us to get involved in world affairs jump on the complete opposite bandwagon and want us to go and fight a war in both fronts. And so this is what's happening in America. You have a lot of people, similar to what happened after September 11th. We're attacked on our home soil, and then people rush to defend this country. People sign up for the draft, and we declare war on all of these countries. So let's do a quick review. What's going on? Well, the U.S., remember, is technically neutral at this time. We are neutral up until December of 1941 when we declare war on Japan. Up until that time, though, we are completely allied with the Allied forces, and we are giving them all the help we can through lend-lease, cash and carry policies. And this is how we aligned ourselves with them. We gave them aid to make sure that they could fight Germany, since we could not actually do the fighting ourselves. And then, because of conflict with Japan, we come to peace talks between the two countries, which fail, and the Japanese think they are trying to prevent us from engaging in a war with them, and they actually awake a sleeping giant, if you will. And so this gets us, this was the spark that causes us to declare war on Europe. And with this video, we will enter World War II in the next chapter, chapter 25, next week. So until next time, Husky historians,